I'm really happy to introduce Loretta Württemberger, founder of Berlin-based Institute for Artist Estates, partner at Fine Art Partners, and co-founder of Contemporary Art Alliance. With a background in international copyright and patent law, Loretta has also worked with artist estates, foundations, and artists on legacy planning and estate management issues for many years. Dr. Württemberger is a leader in this rapidly growing field. The Institute frequently hosts symposia, workshops, and forums, and she lectures worldwide. We are so grateful that Loretta was able to travel here to New York and share her experience and knowledge with us. Please welcome Loretta Württemberger.
Good morning. Before I jump into my presentation, first of all, Christian and Natalie, thank you. We've been organizing a conference of similar size 2 years ago in Berlin. I think some of you have been there. So I know exactly how your last weeks were, and I know what you've been through. And let me just say, I'm very impressed how lively and awake you're still sitting here. And before I jump into my speech, I wanted to tell you a little story about Christian. Because Christian and I don't only share a long-lasting friendship, but also we share a godson. It's Konstantin, and Konstantin is 10 today. And we got to know each other at his baptism, obviously a little less than 10 years ago. And at that baptism, Christian not only sat next to me and was the most charming neighbor at the table, but also he made a present to Konstantin, which impressed me very much. And I tell you this story because I think it says a lot about the generosity of Christian. It was not that he gave him a watch or a silver cup or other traditional things you give a godchild for his baptism, but his present was something very unusual. He gave him a language, meaning that he would support him financially, but also in an immaterial sense for the next 18 years in learning a language. And I thought that was such a great and creative and generous gift that I was very impressed. And I think I can jump into my presentation now, because it was for me also a bit a picture of the metaphor for this conference. You both have been highlighting how this field has been developing so strongly in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think we're still at the beginning of finding and refining a language for many aspects of this field. And I think what you're doing today in putting the focus away from the legal language, which has been in a certain way refined already for this field, to the aspect of conservation is so important, because here we are at the beginning of refining the language and finding a common language, us as a community. I think there are many reasons why this field has come so much into the center of attention in the last decade. One is certainly a general professionalization of the art world. One is certainly the wealth, the money in this field. For me, looking at it historically, it was the beginning with the Andy Warhol Foundation and his death. And this is certainly something which will be going on also for the next decades even more. If you think just about the more or less theoretical possibility of Gerhard Richter dying, what will be left then? We've just had it in Germany with the estate of Polke. Polke was his largest own collector. He left a huge estate worth many hundreds millions of euro. And these estates, which we've seen since the death of Warhol, de Kooning, Rauschenberg, etc., are really large, mid-sized entities which have really called for the need of professionalization. So it's a very natural development coming from a more art market money point of view. But at the same time, I strongly believe there's also a different side to this development, that it comes from our urge in a globalized world to reconnect to our roots. And we all live in a field which is where you have to tell a narrative. Art history is a narrative, and it's about reconnecting also in contemporary art to where we come from. And I think that's a reason also why artist estates have become so important. So the estates have become a true own player in the art world and not only an appendix. They have become increasingly more important and powerful, and will become to continue to be so even more in the next years. That brings with it many possibilities. It means this field has more resources than it ever did before, financial resources, but also professional resources. It has become more influential and will become even more influential, and this on a global scale. That means at the same time that there are quite many challenges for the estates today. You have to deal in a globally highly professionalized and also highly competitive environment. You have to deal with more money involved. You have to deal in that sense with outside pressure. You are in a competitive field, even philanthropy. And so no mistakes are allowed. But before coming to the question of what does that practically mean for the estates, I would like to share with you some thoughts of what is an artist estate. I mean, I think the title here is a bit too sharp, the artist estate's DNA, because I have to admit I've been thinking about this for more than 10 years now, and I still can't really describe it. So I would like to rephrase this and say some thoughts of the artist estate's DNA, because I think one could talk about only this aspect of what is really an artist estate for days. So let me highlight 3-4 aspects I find important in this context. First of all, I think it's important to understand that if we talk about an artist estate, we truly talk about 3 different aspects. First of all, there's the artist and the whole image of the artist, the myth around the artist, the intention of the artist on the one hand side. Then there's his oeuvre, which at the moment an artist has died, it is finished in its totality. And then there's the legacy. And these 3 often don't match, or they sometimes overlap. But each of these develop also a life of its own. The myth around an artist develops. It might develop differently than the evaluation of the oeuvre. And at the same time, the legacy can develop in a different speed than the 2 others can. And I think it's very important to be aware that on a time scale, the life of the oeuvre is obviously longer than the life of the artist. I think actually it's a very privileged situation artists are in, because they have a true place in immortality, and we all know that immortality is something many human beings are craving for. But the legacy is necessarily not that long. If it's ill-managed, if the oeuvre does not stand the test of time, the legacy fades. The second thought is a very different one I wanted to share with you. If you look at an artist estate, I think it's important to understand that there are many stakeholders involved, and each of these stakeholders has a different view on the estate. So an estate is not something static, but it is a kind of amorph creature, which is something else for each of these stakeholders. And as we all know, these stakeholders can have very different interests. When we work with artist estates and do strategic analysis of their situations or help them to develop a strategy or new strategies, what I often do, I ask them to take this circle and first of all write down of the people involved belong to which stakeholder group. Because of simply making that clear, it often already makes clear where the interests are. And then in a second column, to write down the perspective on their interest. And by that, to disclose and make transparent possible conflict of interests, possible allies within these interests, and possible solutions, how to get everybody so involved that it is for the best interest of the oeuvre. A further thought I'd like to share is to understand where the artist estates stand within the art world. Many of you probably know the left circle. It was first drawn by Clemens Greenberg in the 50s, without the word artist estate, only artist. And he had the artist on the left-hand side and the more establishment on the right-hand side. I turned it around because I liked it more to resemble a brain, with the right side of the brain being the artist and the left side being the establishment. And if you convert this circle now into a triangle, I think it makes clear how unstable the establishment is without the artist and the artist estates. The moment that creative part, the oeuvre, goes away, the whole pyramid falls over. And then it's happening something very interesting. The moment an artist dies, it becomes an entity, the estate, or the artist endowed foundation, non-regardless of the legal form it finds at the end. And the artist estate kind of becomes part of the establishment, while at the same time taking care of the oeuvre and being in this double position of at the same time taking the creative process the artist did during his lifetime to a next step and doing this within the establishment. I think it's just important to be clear about this double function of an artist estate. So how do you bring this, the oeuvre, to this stage beyond the lifetime of an artist? I very strongly believe in the reciprocity of the oeuvre and its audience. I think many of you probably have read Walter Benjamin and him pointing out that an oeuvre resonates with the art critique, and that the art critique brings liveliness to the oeuvre itself. So there's a two-way path of keeping a work alive, and that an artwork is not only the static thing or the static artefactor, but it is something alive which resonates to the viewer in form of the art critic in the case of Walter Benjamin. And I think this goes even much further, and it counts especially for the question of how to deal with artist estate and the entrusted responsibility for an oeuvre. Because an oeuvre, for me, dies a second death, actually, or the artist dies a second death, if the oeuvre doesn't stay in a contemporary dialogue with collectors, the museum's world, and the academic world. And I strongly believe that each new generation has to redefine and refine their access to an oeuvre, even if the artist has died a long time ago. And I put this image here. It's the Alte Museum in Berlin, which shows the Greek and Roman antiquities. And it was Nanucci which made this wonderful artwork. All art has been contemporary. And I think it's really important to remember that all art has been contemporary, and it is the question for all of us entrusted with taking care of an artist's legacy: how can we keep that work contemporary, although the artist is no longer there and the time has passed? So for me, being contemporary is not so much a question, is it the art of our time? But does our time have our own and fresh view on that artwork? And if so, it doesn't matter if the artwork was created 50, 60, 70, or 100 years ago, it still is contemporary if that dialogue is there. And that means for me that an artist estate is then successful if it is able to keep the work alive, meaning when generations of artists draw inspiration from the work, when curators, scholars, and collectors continually find new approaches to it. And that means that as an artist estate, you should work within all the three columns of the academic world, the museum's world, and the market world, because that's also the way our art market today works. If you like it or not, what is shown in the museum is bought by the collectors. What is bought by the collectors is supported by museum shows, and what is shown there, again, is written about by the academic world. So it's really an interlinked world, and as an artist estate, it's so important to have all three columns within your view and work with all three columns in an active way. If you do so, it's really a daunting task. And as you said, Christian, most don't come to it, they didn't apply for the job. But at the same time, it's a tough job. It's a very job where you need a lot of knowledge. You have to know a bit about law, although you mostly have advising lawyers, but you have to ask them the right questions. You have to have an idea of the art historic and academic contexts. You have to know about archiving and digitalization, about conservation and restoration, about the museums world. You have to know about the art market, and you have to be able to manage a mid-sized company, meaning financial planning, hiring people, leading people, outside communications, and all of that. So although artist family members are really the most important supporters of that task in the most cases, simply being a family member is no longer enough, especially in this more professionalized and strong art world. And that is why we founded the Institute for Artist Estates. What do? We try to focus on 3 areas. The one is that we offer educational and networking activities within the field. We do research and publications in the field, and we do consulting and management. And by the 3rd column, we finance column 1 and 2. For whom do we do it? We work a lot for artists on their legacy planning, helping them to learn from previous generations what was well done, what was not well done, what can they do during their lifetimes to set the right parameters, and how to balance giving direction to future generations and at the same time giving enough freedom that these future generations can develop also their own creativity in this task. We work for families and heirs. We work for artist estates executives. We work for galleries, helping them how to deal with artist estates, developing strategies there. And for other professionals, meaning mainly lawyers, which often are very strong on the legal and tax side, but often lack expertise, for example, in the question of how to archive, what archiving software should you need, how should you maneuver within the art world, etc. I don't want to go into this in too detail, but what is important for me to say is that the team is very much based on people who have been working with an artist estate for many years. It's my husband, Daniel Timple, and myself. For us, it was also a family matter. The grandfather of my husband was an artist at the Bauhaus, a silversmith. And my husband inherited that estate, I think it's now 15 years ago. And the challenging part of that was that it was art historically quite important, but of no commercial value, more or less, because it was a silversmith estate. And so we had to learn it quite the hard way without strong financial resources, how to navigate in that field. I have been taking care of the estate of Jean Arp for almost 10 years now, so it's the total opposite than the estate of Wolfgang Tümpel, because it's one of the most accepted masters of sculpture in the 20th century. So it's something very different. Helen Vandenberg has, with her brothers together, taken care of the estate of her father, who died in 1996. And Carl von Todt, being a trained lawyer, which often helps in this field, it comes from a family who has been dealing with passing on legacy for many hundred of years, so brings in that family approach. Why do we do what we do at the Institute for Artist Estate? First of all, for us it's very important to build a community. When I wrote my book, which I started I think 6-7 years ago, I went out there and interviewed more than 50 estates. And it was really an interesting experience for me because I had the feeling most of them had never talked to each other. That has changed now in the last 5 years because we've seen more and more conferences, and I think this one is again a wonderful example of how to bring us all together. But it was a field in which there was not really a networking platform, and often children had the feeling they have to reinvent the wheel again, and they're thrown into the cold water the moment they inherited this and sit in front of the huge piles of boxes and a chaotic studio and have no idea what to do. And have to kind of reinvent the wheel for themselves again. So for us, it's really important to build a community, to bring people together and stay in touch with them. It's about sharing knowledge. It's about deepening the research in this area. Also, this is really interesting for me. I mean, I've been talking to quite a number of faculties, or art historic faculties, and there's almost no academic research on the history or the the strategics or the importance of artist estates. The art historians often put it in the field of kind of management, but it doesn't belong there, obviously. The management people do it in the field of art history. And so we're trying to campaign and support also financially academic research on the field. We help artists to plan their legacies, because that was another thing in these interviews. At the end, I always asked 2-3 similar questions to each of the estates. And one of the questions was, if you could have a wish to your father or your mother or your grandfather or your husband today in regard to the estate, what would you have wished for today out of your experience, your perspective today? And mostly all of them said, I wish they would have done more before they die and let us know more what they want before they die. And I mean, I totally understand if artists don't want to deal with this. Artists, I mean, it's the center of their meaning is to create art. They don't want to talk with lawyers and talk about archiving and all that stuff. But it's a great present to the ongoing generations if they take the time and the energy to deal with these issues during their lifetime. And we help legacy managers with this overwhelming task. We do this in form of conferences. This was just a short overview of the 2016 conference. The next one will be 2019 in Los Angeles, probably in May. The exact date will be to be announced. Then we do smaller sized workshops. While the conferences have a size of 200, 250 people, the workshops are limited to 25. And it's often a 3 or 4 day, 8 hours a day, very deep immersion into the topic, where we try to give hands-on advice and also hands-on case studies, how to deal with the issues in detail. We do this in cooperation often with other estates and institutions. The next workshop in Berlin will be in June this year. Christian will be coming, and after having seen your wheel of questions towards the artwork, I'm really looking forward that you have there the time to dig into it in more detail, because I think it's so interesting what you build up there. And it's really, I think one could do 2 days only about that wheel and look into the single aspects of what you've been showing us. Here, just some impressions. Oh, this is just, I just have to tell you about this. This is the estate of Lynne Chadwick. Lynne Chadwick was a wonderful English sculptor, and during his lifetime, financially quite successful, so he was able to buy this wonderful place, which is at the edge of a mountain, and you overlook the English landscapes, and there are some sheep, and in between all these sheep are his artworks. It looks phenomenal, and then it's a bit misty and windy, and it's about 1.5 hours, 2 hours from London, and if you ever go to London, go there. It's the most amazing place. This is a bit of the feedback we got. Then we do ongoing research. We continue our interview series. We've expanded now the interviews to more than 80. I give lectures, or we all as a team give lectures. And we publicized this book in 2016. And then we do management and consulting in this area. And here we build again on that triangle I was talking before, that the whole basis of what we do is that as I said, believe that you have to work actively in all 3 areas, the academic, the art market, the museum area. And to give you some examples of what we do, here the estates of Hans Arp and Sophie Teuber-Arp, as well as Keith Arnett. I wanted to talk, because we're talking today about contemporary artist estates, a bit about the 2 examples, Random International and Wim Wenders, because they might be interesting because they're still living artists. With Random International, it's really interesting. It's 2 artists who work together under the brand Random International. You might have seen the Rain Room here at here in New York. It was also at the LACMA in LA. It was in Asia. It was at the Barbican in England. And what Random International does is very technical art, technically based art. And they totally got it that in order to later leave a proper legacy, they must today deal with these questions, although they are young. They're not in their 80s and suddenly thinking, I have to do something. But they're in their 40s and asked us to help them with restructuring the whole archive. And in this process, a couple of very interesting questions on conservation came up. For example, the question, if they are gone in 50 years, also at least half of the technical components within their artworks will also be gone. And how do you deal with that? And is it for them about creating the technical experience, or is it for them creating this experience exactly with that light bulb? And so what we've developed is a system, because they don't feel like writing all that down, they want to do art, as I said, that we're doing in the process of doing an interview series on video with them for every single artwork they've been doing, and installing a process, an ongoing process. When they do new artwork, they just do a little 10-minute video where we have prepared questions and where we ask them, what is your intention in connection with the technical transformation of your intention? So would you be okay that if with the rain room, for example, in 50 years you have totally different 3D devices to navigate the viewer through the rain room, if that device would be replaced by a totally different device than the device you took today? Or is it important for you that those little slowing down sequences, which have today a technical background, will be also kept there in 50 years? So the questions, Christian, you were raising also about what is the intention of the artist when Beuys did the lemon, I think it's something you can integrate very strongly into the archival practice of a living artist when he builds his archive, which later will be the basis for a legacy. With Wim Wenders, the filmmaker, who's at the same time also a photographic artist, we are doing the whole strategic planning of his legacy. He has a foundation by now, and the question are of similar extent. It's about conservation. Does he want posthumous editing of his works? If so, how should it be done? What family members shall take care of it? Are those family members willing to step up to the task? And if they're willing, are they fit for it? Do they need a special training? So you see, it's really a 360-degree view we try to take when helping artist estates to deal with this huge responsibility. Yes, well, thank you.